Alright guys, we're gonna get ready for the second talk.
I'm going to sit down most of the time. I know you stood up some of it, but I'm going to sit down. Again, my name is Chris. I've been using Angular for maybe 5 months, 4 months. Been working on a couple apps with it. I'll show you one towards the end with some really complex directives in it. But I'm just going to start off kind of slow. And directives, I think, are, when I started using Angular, they were one of the harder things for me to figure out and learn. There's a lot to them. I'm not going to be able to touch on everything tonight, but I'll get you kind of started. We already saw some directives tonight: the ng click, the ng include, the ng model. Those are all directives that are built into Angular, already ready to go. I'm going to focus more on creating your own directive. So, what are directives? Directives allow us to control and manipulate the DOM. Just like the old school, I used to do like a jQuery document ready, and you would bind events to buttons and paragraphs and whatever, all your different elements. Angular takes care of that for us by providing attributes and handling the binding behind the scenes and matching up an event or a value with a particular attribute on your HTML elements. They can be invoked with custom tag element names, attributes, class names, and comments. I've never really done anything with comments or class names. I usually use tag element names or attributes. And when you kind of look at other people's source code, you'll notice that's kind of the overwhelming majority of people use. But you can use comments and class names. How does it work? So, obviously we're building single page apps here, so we're not refreshing the browser every time, using the document ready type binding methodology. So when you load something asynchronously, then Angular gets it, it looks at the DOM elements that it's loaded, and then it compiles that information into a template, and then it binds and links the controller model attributes with the template, and then it renders it into your browser. So it's a multi-step process that happens all behind the scenes. It happens pretty quickly. But it's critical to know this process when you start getting into more custom directives with a lot of functionality and things that go on. Like for instance, if you load a template, you might want to manipulate the template before you start binding things. So it's really important to know that whole process and how it works. I'm going to focus more on kind of more simple directives. Let me just go ahead and show you the first example that I made here. This is a pretty common thing that we do every day as app developers. We want, yeah. So we have a text input here, and we want to type into it. And then, if this is a login form, we want to be able to hit enter to submit the form, essentially. So I hit enter, and what I did is I output the display of whatever I typed in here over here. So as soon as I clicked enter in here, I essentially told the model, hey, I'm all done with this, and I invoke a function on it. Here's the HTML code. I'm not actually sure how to zoom in on this. Oh, there. Oh, okay.
So there's no form. It's not actually.
Yeah, you don't have to have a form. So I have an input. This is standard stuff here, class. I'm using Twitter Bootstrap for the CSS, so it looks pretty. So this is how my directive gets set up here. I have this enter submit, which is obviously a custom attribute. That's not a part of HTML. That's not a normal thing. So my directive is actually called enter submit, and I'm passing it a function, enter pressed, which is part of my controller over here. See, I have scope enter pressed equals function. And then the model, so whenever I'm typing into that input, it's bound to input value, is the model value. Going back at Rit's example, that would be car.number for everybody that saw that. So here's my controller. It's real simple. I just have 4 basic values. I have 2 functions. because I just want to show you the difference, two different ways you can do the same thing. So I type in here, hit enter, and the value changes. I type in here, I hit enter, and the value changes. The value is actually outputting right here. Input value submitted, input value submitted. So I'm not setting input value submitted until I actually click enter. And if you look at the controller, scope enter pressed equals function, I'm actually setting it right here. So they're just sort of mirrored attributes. Now if we look at the actual directive, there's many different ways to write directives, and some of them are really complex, especially when you get into compiling, pre-link and post-link compiling. I'm just going to kind of stick to the more basic, simple type of directives that probably you'll be writing most of the time. Maybe 75% of the time will be stuff like this. So, earlier we saw that you can use a factory method or you can use a directive function. This is the same as, app.service as opposed to app factory service name. This is just the way that I like to do it. To me, it makes sense to say app directive. I know what I'm building as opposed to app.factory. So here's the name of the directive, and you'll notice it's enter submit camel cased, and that syncs up with my attribute name. So if my attribute name was auto-focus, then my directive name would be autofocus camel cased. The second parameter is a function, and essentially all I'm doing is returning a function. So as soon as Angular loads up the DOM and it sees that this text input here has the enter submit attribute, it's going to apply this function and bind this function with my text input. This is the exact same thing as a link function, which I'll show you right down here. These are the exact same directive, just done two different ways. I'm returning a function. I'm binding a key down. Notice I'm not using jQuery here. Angular has a jQuery Lite built into it, so you don't have to, unless you want to use more advanced jQuery type stuff like animation or some of the fancier stuff, plugins, things like that. You can usually get away with using Angular's jQuery. So I'm just binding a key down event, and if the key code is 13, anybody that's done this with jQuery knows exactly what this is. This is the exact same thing. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm passing in a second attribute. Enter submit. I'm passing in enter pressed, which is a function name which is on the controller. So as soon as I hit enter and I get the right key code, scope actually relates to the controller up here. And then I'm doing an apply method. And then I'm going to take the value of the enter submit attribute, which is enter pressed, which is a function name, and I'm going to call that on the scope. So this essentially fires off this function here, enter pressed. Now, in my browser, I have two of these. Here's the second one here, and it's a different directive name, enter submit link, and then enter press 2, which is a completely different method over here. But you can see that I'm just passing in a function name as the value of the attribute, and then that's what's actually getting called on the controller. Does that make sense? Everybody follow that?
So scope and element attributes are standard things for directives, right? And they're inferred from the DOM.
Okay, so when you have a link, this is actually the same thing. Like, I'm just returning a function here. On this one, I'm returning an object with a link function. But technically, these work the same way. But essentially, when you have a linking function, which is what happens when Angular takes your DOM and it takes the functionality you want to add to it and it binds them together. That's the linking function. Anytime you have that, it always passes in scope, which would be the scope above the directive. In this case, it's the controller. You have your element that the the directive is actually on. In our case, that's the text input. And then you have attributes, which are all of these right here are getting passed in. The type equals text, class is span 4, enter submit, and ng model. So technically, all of these things are getting passed in. And if we just do like a quick console log attributes, you can see that. See, we have class, enter submit link, ng model, and type. So always the scope, the element, and the attributes get passed into the link function in that order. And that's how you pass information into a directive.
So if these are the same, what can you do with the link that you can't do with the bare, for example?
Nothing, it's all the same.
It's just
If
totally
you
the same,
don't, if
functionally
you
the
don't,
same.
right, if you return a function, only a function from a directive, it's the exact same thing as saying, I'm returning a linking function. The exact same
If
thing.
it's just one function.
If it's just one function.
Just the same.
If you return a function as opposed to an object, it's assuming you're returning a linking function. All right, let's go on to a new one. So here we have an editable text directive. I have a controller, one controller, and it has this value here. And the value is also shown here, but I can edit it. Forget about typos. Say done, and it updates it on the controller. So let's take a look at that code. And I actually have quite a few nested directives going on here as well. So here's my HTML. Value from the controller model is text value, so this is just evaluating the value of text value, which is my scope attribute. Essentially my ng model, that's what that is. And then I just have a div here, which is editable text is the name of my directive. And I'm passing in text value, which is as you'll notice, when I type in here, I'm essentially telling it that's the ng model. And then just again, outputting it there again. So now let's look at the JavaScript. My controller is very simple. All I'm doing is storing text value, and then I have a function all done. My text value, I have a default value on it. So when I refresh the page, you'll see, here's the value, directives rock. And then I have a couple different directives. This is the primary directive here. This is editable text. So you'll see my div has the attribute editable text. And what I'm doing here is I'm going to return an object, so I'm going to get a little bit more complicated. I'm not just returning a linking function anymore. I'm actually going to do some more nitty-gritty type work in here. I'll get back to scope in a minute. Template, if anybody's ever used Backbone, or I think Ember does it as well, you do a lot of work with templates. You'll load up a template, you'll compile it, maybe an underscore template or a mustache template, but essentially you give it an HTML string, and you have variables in it, and then it compiles the template and stores it in memory. That way it can make a bunch of copies of it over and over and over very quickly. So we can do that with Angular as well inside of our directives. So what I'm doing is I'm getting an entirely new DOM structure here. And then I'm going to say replace true, which means that this div is going to get completely wiped out and replaced with this template. So this HTML code is actually going to replace the original div code that I had. So if we look at we inspect the DOM, I don't know if you guys can see this. You can see that that is actually true. So div class row, and then I have my spans, and then all this other stuff down here. So this one simple div, if you think of, anytime you embed like a Twitter widget inside of a site, or a Facebook like button or whatever. Usually it's this one little tag or one little script, and then the DOM wipes that out or replaces it with more complex data structure. That's essentially what's going on here, is that we're taking this one little div and we're getting more complex with it. So we don't have to clutter up our HTML pages, our views, with all of this nonsense. We can just provide this simple little tag right here. And that's one of the most powerful things about the directives, is that they're very reusable, they're compact, they don't clutter up your code. Yes?
Instead of having the whole HTML onto the JavaScript, that template, can
Right
you
here.
just call a partial, like a view?
Yeah, you can. If I said rather than template, you can do template URL and then pass in a URL to an HTML file. It'll load it asynchronously. As soon as it's loaded, it'll then pass it through the linking functions, etc. So yeah, absolutely.
What's the impact on the loading time if you do that with many?
Well, I mean, this little amount of text right here is tiny, so that wouldn't take very long to load. Obviously, there is more time involved, but ultimately you're going to load it either in this JavaScript file or you're going to load it from an HTML later. Really, I guess it's just a design.
I was more asking about if you split it too much up into